This quiet stretch of Texas ranchland once ran the entire United States. For nearly 5 years in the 1960s, laws were signed here, generals were summoned here, and heads of state ate barbecue a few steps from the cattle pens. Today, we are walking Lyndon B. Johnson National Historical Park in the heart of the Texas Hill Country. It is the only place in America where you can trace a president from the room where he was born to the schoolhouse he attended, to the ranch he governed from, to the oak trees he is buried under. All of it sits along one small green river. Come walk it with us. We are about an hour west of Austin in the Texas Hill Country. The park comes in 2 pieces, roughly 14 miles apart, strung along the Pedernales River. The first is in the town of Johnson City in Blanco County, where the boyhood home and the old family settlement stand. The second is the LBJ Ranch near Stonewall in Gillespie County, the place the newspapers came to call the Texas White House. Together, the 2 districts protect around 1,500 acres of homes, barns, pastures, and river bottom. It is the 17th of January, and the hill country wears its winter colors. The grasses have gone tawny and gold, but the live oaks hold their leaves all year, so the land never looks entirely asleep. January days here are often mild and bright, perfect walking weather, with none of the heavy heat this country is famous for in summer. The crowds are thin, the light is low and warm, and the cattle have the pastures mostly to themselves. It is a fine season to meet this landscape slowly on foot. The hill country is the ragged eastern edge of the Edwards Plateau, a great table of limestone laid down under a shallow sea in the age of the dinosaurs. Rivers like the Pedernales have spent millions of years carving that limestone into rounded hills, sudden bluffs, and clear spring-fed streams. The soil on the uplands is thin and stony, better suited to juniper, live oak, and prickly pear than to row crops. But along the river bottoms, the ground turns deep and dark, and that narrow ribbon of good land is where the story of this park begins. In the hill country, everything follows the water. The river that ties this whole park together is the Pedernales, and Texans will tell you firmly that it is pronounced Pedernales, whatever the spelling says. It rises to the west and runs east through Stonewall and Johnson City on its way to the Colorado River. Lyndon Johnson spent his whole life within reach of this water. He was born beside it, he bought his ranch on its banks, and he chose to be buried a short walk from it. To understand the man, the locals say, you have to understand this river country first. The name Pedernales is Spanish, and it means flints. Early Spanish travelers found the riverbed and its gravel bars studded with hard nodules of flint and chert, weathered out of the surrounding limestone. That stone mattered long before anyone wrote the name down, because flint takes a sharp edge, and for thousands of years people of this region worked it into tools and points. So the river's very name records the oldest human industry in these hills. It is a small reminder that this valley was valued long before there were ranches or presidents. On the edge of Johnson City stands a weathered dog-trot cabin of squared oak logs, 2 rooms joined by an open breezeway that catches the wind. This is the Johnson settlement, where the president's grandfather, Sam Ely Johnson Sr., settled with his brother Tom in the 1860s. The dog-trot design was frontier air conditioning, a shaded corridor where the family could work and sleep through the Texas summer. Around the cabin, the park preserves an old barn, a windmill, and a cooler house from the ranching years that followed. It looks humble, but for a few remarkable years, this little homestead was the headquarters of a cattle empire. After the Civil War, Texas was poor in cash, but absurdly rich in longhorn cattle, which ran half wild through the brush. Beef that was nearly worthless here could fetch many times the price at the new railheads in Kansas. Sam and Tom Johnson saw the opening and went to work, gathering cattle from the surrounding hill country into their pens at the settlement. From this valley, they organized drives north on the great cattle trails, pushing thousands of animals toward the railroad in a single season. They became known as some of the biggest trail drivers in this part of Texas. Picture the scene as those drives moved out. A river of horned cattle stretched along the trail, walking 10 or 12 miles a day, with drovers on horseback holding the edges of the herd. The route ran north for hundreds of miles through open country, across rivers and storms, taking months to reach the Kansas railheads. A successful drive could return a fortune in gold coin, and for a while the Johnson brothers rode that boom as high as anyone. It was dangerous, dusty, uncertain work, and it built the first Johnson name in this valley. Like most cattle booms, this one broke quickly. In the 1870s, the market turned, prices collapsed, and the brothers came home from the trail owing more than their herds would bring. Sam Ely Johnson had to give up the headquarters land, and the family's fortunes shrank back to the scale of an ordinary hill country farm. But the Johnsons did not leave the valley. They stayed on the Pedernales, farming and ranching in leaner times, and that stubborn attachment to this particular place would shape everything that came after. The empire was gone, but the roots held. The town itself was the work of the next generation. In 1879, James Polk Johnson, a nephew of Old Sam who had ridden on the trail drives, laid out a townsite on land along the Pedernales, donating 320 acres for the purpose. The new settlement naturally took the family name, Johnson City, though it was never much more than a courthouse village. By 1890, it had won the county seat of Blanco County, which it holds to this day. So the future president did not name the town after himself, as visitors sometimes assume. The town came first, named for his cousin, and the boy arrived later. That boy was Lyndon Baines Johnson, 36th President of the United States. He was a tall, restless, overwhelming figure, a schoolteacher's son who mastered the Congress like few people before or since. As president, he signed the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, Medicare, and a flood of education and anti-poverty laws, while the war in Vietnam consumed his final years in office. Historians still argue about him, and probably always will. But here in the hill country, you meet him differently, not as a monument, but as a neighbor, and nearly his entire life story fits inside the few miles of river valley we are walking today. The story starts near Stonewall, on a farm on the north bank of the Pedernales. There, in a small farmhouse, Lyndon Johnson was born on the 27th of August, 1908, the first child of Sam Ely Johnson Jr. and Rebecca Baines Johnson. His father farmed and served in the Texas legislature, and his mother, unusually for the time and place, was a college-educated woman who prized books above almost everything. It was a household short on money and long on ambition. And it stood within sight of the pastures his grandfather had once driven cattle across. The original Birthplace farmhouse fell into ruin decades ago, but the house you see on the ranch today is no ordinary reconstruction. In 1964, while he was president, Johnson had the little house rebuilt on the spot, furnished with family pieces, and he used it as a guest house and liked to show it to visitors himself. That makes it the only presidential birthplace in America reconstructed under the direction of the sitting president it honors. Critics found the gesture immodest, and Johnson did not much care. He wanted people to see exactly where and how humbly his story began. Just down the river from the birthplace stands a tiny one-room schoolhouse called the Junction School. In 1912, at only 4 years old, young Lyndon began tagging along after the older children, and at his mother's urging, the teacher, Miss Katie Dedrich, agreed to take him in. She taught 8 grades in that single room, and the smallest pupil insisted on sitting in her lap while he read his lessons. His first term was cut short when a whooping cough epidemic closed the school. But something about that room stayed with him for the rest of his life. The Junction School is about as simple as an American school can be. One room, a porch, a row of windows for light, plain benches, and a blackboard, serving the farm families scattered along the river. Schools like this once covered rural Texas by the thousand, and most of them have vanished. This one survived because of who its smallest student turned out to be. For Johnson, who went on to work his way through a teacher's college and to teach poor children in South Texas, this little building was where his lifelong obsession with education began. On the 11th of April, 1965, President Johnson came back to the Junction School to sign the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, one of the largest commitments the federal government had ever made to schools. He signed it outdoors, at a picnic table on the school lawn with his first teacher, by then Mrs. Kate Dedrich Loney, seated beside him. Reporters noted that the president had come 3/4 of the way across the country to sign a school bill at the school where he learned to read. Johnson said that day that no measure he had signed, or would ever sign, meant more to the future of America. It remains one of the great pieces of political theater ever staged at a one-room school. When Lyndon was 5, the family moved 14 miles downriver into Johnson City, into a modest white frame house with deep porches. That boyhood home is the anchor of the park's town district, and it is preserved much as it was in the 1920s. Money was tight, and the father's debts and the mother's expectations pressed hard on the eldest son. Lyndon grew up doing chores, shining shoes, and listening to courthouse politics, and he graduated from the little high school here at 15. Neighbors remembered a boy who could not stand still and could not stop talking. The front porch of that boyhood home earned its own place in political history. In 1937, when a congressional seat suddenly came open, 28-year-old Lyndon Johnson stood on this porch and announced his first campaign for the United States Congress. He ran as an all-out supporter of President Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal, stumping every crossroads in the district. He won, and the victory carried him to Washington, where Roosevelt took a shine to the tireless young Texan. Every later Johnson campaign, for Senate, for Vice President, for President, traces back to that porch in Johnson City. Johnson never truly left this valley, no matter how far his career carried him. In 1951, by then a United States Senator, he bought a rundown ranch house and its land on the Pedernales from his widowed aunt, right beside the farm where he was born. Lady Bird was dismayed at first by the shabby old house, but the couple threw themselves into fixing the place, and it became the true center of their lives. The ranch grew into a working cattle operation that Johnson managed obsessively, down to the daily weight of the calves. He called it his own private demonstration that a hill country boy had made good. When Johnson became president in 1963, the ranch house on the Pedernales became something no ordinary ranch house had ever been. The press named it the Texas White House, and it earned the title because Johnson spent roughly a quarter of his time in office right here. The house sprouted communication lines, secret service posts, and staff offices, and cabinet officers found themselves holding meetings under the big live oak in the front yard. Foreign leaders came to the Pedernales and were fed barbecue and shown cattle, a style the papers called barbecue diplomacy. Decisions about laws, budgets, and the war in Vietnam were made in these rooms, in the middle of a Hereford ranch. Working visits to the ranch had a rhythm all their own. Johnson would tour his pastures with visiting officials and reporters packed into his car, talking politics and cattle in the same breath. Aides learned that the business of the nation might be conducted at the cattle pens, at the dinner table, or rolling across a field at high speed. It was showmanship, but it was also strategy, because on his own land in his own country, Johnson held every advantage over his guests. Few presidents have ever fused home and office so completely. Getting a president to a remote ranch took some doing. The big presidential jet, a Boeing 707, needed far more runway than the modest airstrip here could offer. So Johnson would fly from Washington to a big airbase near Austin, then transfer to a small Lockheed Jetstar for the short hop to the ranch strip. Since the little jet carried the president, it officially became Air Force One, but Johnson liked to call it Air Force 1/2. The Jetstar on display near the hangar today is the same type he used, and the joke has outlived the man. Here is the detail that makes this park nearly unique in the national park system. The LBJ Ranch is still a real, working cattle ranch, run by the National Park Service itself. Park staff manage the pastures, work the herd, and keep the operation going essentially as Johnson ran it in the 1960s. Visitors can see the show barn where cattle were groomed and displayed, and watch ranch work that has not fundamentally changed in 60 years. Rangers here will tell you they are preserving not just buildings, but a way of life. The cattle themselves are part of the historic fabric. Johnson raised registered Hereford cattle, the classic red-bodied, white-faced breed of the mid-century American ranch, and he was fiercely proud of them. He showed his best animals, gave calves as gifts, and interrogated his foreman about the herd from the White House by telephone. The Herefords grazing these pastures today are descendants of Johnson's own registered herd, kept on as a living historical collection. Not many national parks can say their livestock has a pedigree older than the park. Johnson and Lady Bird began giving this place to the country while he was still alive, donating the ranch lands to the National Park Service in 1972 while keeping the right to live there. Johnson attached one famous condition, insisting that the ranch remain a working ranch and not become what he called a sterile relic of the past. The park itself had been authorized in December of 1969 as a National Historic Site, and Congress renamed it a National Historical Park in 1980. Every working corral and grazing pasture you pass is that promise being kept. Few park founding documents contain a clearer instruction or a more Texan one. The country around the ranch has its own quieter fame. Stonewall and the surrounding stretch of Gillespie County are the heart of Texas peach country, a legacy of the German immigrant farm families who settled this region in the 1800s and learned what its soils could do. The sandy loam along the Pedernales and the warm summers produce famously sweet fruit, and Stonewall proudly calls itself the peach capital of Texas. In January, the orchards are bare gray rows, resting. But come June, roadside stands from here to Fredericksburg pile high with peaches, and half of Texas seems to drive out for them. No portrait of this valley is complete without Lady Bird Johnson. As First Lady, she became America's great champion of native wildflowers and roadside beauty, lending her name to the Highway Beautification Act of 1965, and later founding a National Wildflower Research Center in Austin. Every spring, her beloved bluebonnets, paintbrush, and coreopsis still flood these hill country roadsides in blue and crimson and gold. After the president's death, she lived on at the ranch she loved, remaining its heart for more than 3 decades, until her own death in 2007. Around here, many will tell you the spring wildflowers are her true memorial. Johnson left the White House in January 1969 and came straight home to the Pedernales. He spent 4 years as a rancher, growing his hair long, writing his memoirs, and pushing his cattle operation as hard as he had once pushed senators. On the 22nd of January, 1973, he suffered a final heart attack at the ranch and died before he could reach the hospital in San Antonio. He was 64 years old. He had lived almost exactly 4 years past his presidency, nearly all of it on this land. And this January walk of hours falls in the same quiet season the valley lost him. Johnson was buried in the small family cemetery on the ranch, under a grove of massive live oaks beside the Pedernales, just a short walk from the reconstructed house where he was born. Lady Bird was laid beside him in 2007, among generations of Johnsons in the same walled plot. The headstone is plain Texas granite, and the trees above it are far older than the republic he led. Visitors often say it is one of the most peaceful presidential grave sites in the country. There is no eternal flame here, only wind in the oak leaves and the river running past. Stand back, and the shape of this place is remarkable. Within a stretch of river you can walk in an afternoon lie the settlement where the family began, the room where a president was born, the school where he learned to read, the porch where he launched his career, the house where he governed a nation, and the oaks where he rests. Almost no other American life of such scale can be traced on foot like this, beginning to end, in its own home landscape. That is what this park protects, not marble but working land and the whole arc of a life. The cattle graze on, the river keeps moving, and the story stays rooted right here. Our January walk through Lyndon B. Johnson National Historical Park ends here, by the pastures along the Pedernales. If you come yourself, give the day to both halves of the park, the boyhood home and settlement in Johnson City, and the ranch drive at Stonewall, and in spring, come when the bluebonnets are up. Entry to the park is free, and the cattle, the river, and the history are all waiting. This valley raised a president and then welcomed him home, and it has room for a traveler or two besides. Thank you for watching. Follow for more of the trails of the world.